Hello and welcome to my channel. Maybe this was a mistake, but here we are. I may not be very talented, but I love drawing, and for this video, I decided to create a beautiful sunflower.
Not the one appearing on screen. Certainly, that is the kind of sunflower and I did draw it, but I am talking about a different one.
I'm not very smart either, and I'll show every stage of the process, from the first spark of an idea to the final details, so you can watch the artwork come to life. Doesn't it sound like a reasonably interesting video? It does to me, so let's dive in. To start, I'm doing some quick sketches as a brainstorm to see what I can come up with. I'm testing different shapes and ideas. The more different they are from each other, the better. That way, I'll have more options when choosing the main concept to base the character on. Even though I'm not sure what I'll end up doing, one thing I'm pretty sure about is that I want the character's identity to be strongly connected to plants. First, because I like them, they are perfect for decoration, and I enjoy seeing how they slowly grow every day, but more importantly for today's purpose, they are fun to draw, because they give you so much freedom. They can have almost any color and shape. Plus, since every plant is unique, they are almost impossible to draw wrong. After a few iterations, I found something interesting, combining two concepts, a sunflower and a scarecrow. The sunflower will sprout from the scarecrow's hat as if it were its flower pot. Since I already have a fairly clear plan of what I want to do, I'm going to hide the little drawings I've been making and create a new empty layer so I have more space to keep working on my drawing. To better connect both concepts, I'm exploring the idea of the sunflower controlling the scarecrow, with its roots reaching inside and plugging into its head. It's essentially a flower with armor.
Or like Iron Man, but on a farm. Or like Batman, but also on a farm. Well, I think you got my point.
With the first sketch already completed, where the general proportions of the character and all visual elements are already defined, I use this layer with transparency as a guide to continue working on and refining the drawing. This time, I'm separating the different elements that make up my character into layerish layers, so I have more flexibility when moving or changing the size of each element without affecting the rest of the layer stack. To improve readability, I use a different color for each layer so I can quickly identify which elements are in each of the layerish layers. I want the sunflower to have a slightly unsettling expression, with completely white eyes and no pupils. There is also the idea of giving it a somewhat absurd face by making it so small, aiming for a balance between something scary but still cute. After all, it is a flower. Throughout the design, spiral elements have been incorporated, such as the one at the center of the flower or the small twists present in the roots and the stem. This symbol was chosen because it is often associated with hypnosis scenes where a spinning spiral appears, suggesting the idea that the scarecrow is under the sunflower's influence. It fits well with the concept of the character. I start applying color over the sketch, which, although still a bit rough, is quite close to what could be the final design. I am using a separate layerish layer for each color tone, so I can make changes and try different color combinations quickly within the layer stack. With this step, I aim to get an impression as close as possible to the final layer result, but without spending too much time. This way, I can make any adjustments I find necessary before it is too late, since trying to make changes when the drawing is almost finished is much more time-consuming. I am using a color palette with autumn tones that personally evoke a rural setting with its crops. To add a magical touch, I will make the rake and watering can appear to be made of gold. In my opinion, this fits well with the idea behind the character.
Although, thinking about it, it might not be a good idea scarecrow to have such shiny gold pieces, since they could attract crows, which is exactly the opposite of what a scarecrow is meant to do by definition. Ah, very funny. Well, actually not really. Sorry.
With a much clearer idea of what I want to do, I start drawing what will become the final piece on a new empty layer. The existing sketch is not used, as it allows more freedom to pose the character differently or explore another perspective, although in this case, the changes made in that regard are minor. From here, I repeat the same steps as before. I finish the sketch layer and apply color to the color layer. It may seem somewhat redundant, but going through several iterations of the same idea always helps refine and improve the final result. This time, I decided to add a shadow layer to create a stronger sense of volume using a dark tone and a blending mode that makes the colors underneath darker. This works better than using black with transparency over the drawing, as it lets me tint the shadows with color, making the result visually more interesting and also more effective for shaping the values of any kind of color. On the other hand, I'm avoiding applying the shadows directly to the character's color layer-ish layer. This way, I can always go back and adjust the color layer as much as I want without worrying about messing up the shadows layer. It's time for some line work. I use the sketch on a lower layer with reduced opacity as a guide, as I have done before. I also switch to a brush with no opacity variation, where the only parameter that changes with pen pressure is line thickness. This gives me a much cleaner and more defined line. At this stage, the goal is for the lines to be as clean and clear as possible, since they will be the ones used in the final result. I split the line work of the drawing into two layers, one for the outer lines and the outline of each individual element, and another layer with a thinner line weight for details, such as the texture of the hat or the folds in the clothing. I like to keep these groups of lines on separate layerish layers so I can apply slightly different colors to each layer and change them easily and quickly whenever I want.
That's the beauty of separating elements into layers. It makes everything so much easier to edit independently. That's so convenient.
Once the line work is finished, I duplicate the layers to keep refining the drawing. I make adjustments to the lines using the same brushes from the sketching phase until I'm happy with the result. This new layer then serves as a reference, so I can transfer those changes back to the original line work. At this stage, I move on to applying color to the drawing. I use practically the same tones I have already tested previously, although I make small variations during the process. A brush with no transparency is used, and for now, I just focus on using flat colors. To create the shadows, I start with a single layer that affects the entire drawing. This allows me to establish the general lighting without too much detail or precision, giving me a better sense of the light source and which areas should be shaded. Afterward, I apply this layer to each element independently and continue refining the shapes of the shadows. The point of splitting the shadow layerish layer into several layers, so they affect each color layer in isolation, is that it allows me to be less precise with my brush strokes. I don't have to worry about
you know
painting
what?
over other elements that...
I think we already have enough of this layerish layers talk. Listen to this music instead. I like it.
To simulate the ambient light color, I apply a soft orange tint to all the unshaded areas of the drawing. This helps create more harmony between the characters' different hues by unifying them with a subtle tint. Using this orange tone kind of makes it feel like the sunflower is just enjoying a beautiful sunset. Then I continue by adding the light glow. I give it a warm tone that works well with the orange tint I used earlier. I feel like this reinforces the idea that the scene could be lit by a sunset. At the same time, I add a few secondary light accents to outline the character in the shadowed areas, placing them in the opposite direction of the main light source. In this very moment, I realize I made a small mistake with the perspective. The rake pole should pass in front of the arm, but the way I have it now doesn't feel entirely natural and makes the pose look a bit stiff. It would probably be a quick and easy fix, though I decide to leave it as it is. I don't completely dislike the effect it creates, and I think it gives the piece a certain character. Besides, this drawing is far from perfect, and fixing this slight perspective issue wouldn't really improve it in any meaningful way, so I'm just going to keep it as is. After spending some time refining how the light and shadows interact with the character, I've decided to adjust the colors of the lighting since they were only placeholders. I'm using a blue tone for the secondary light to create a nice contrast with the warm orange of the primary light. Besides being aesthetically pleasing, this color combination reminds me of Van Gogh's The Starry Night. In a way, it's even justified from a design standpoint, as Van Gogh is also famous for his sunflowers, and this drawing features a pretty great one. For me, that is reason enough to use this color combination for the lighting. Not that I really needed one in the first place anyway. It's time to add some texture and break away from the flat colors in the drawing. They've been useful for understanding how the different tones and lights interact, but it's time to move past that. First, I'm using a brush with variable opacity to create different levels of shading. The effect is subtle. I'm not going for realism at all, but rather adding a bit of visual complexity. For the highlights, I use a different brush with a tiny little dotty texture. It adds a pretty interesting noise effect, and to keep it from being too distracting, the brush has some transparency, which helps keep the result more subtle and controlled. To break up the areas that still look a bit flat, I'm adding some slight tonal variations to the character's base color. I do this with the lighting layers turned off to get a better look at how these changes affect the original colors. It makes sense to do this because in real life, you rarely see an object with a perfectly uniform tone. There are always small imperfections or nuances that break up that monotony. To finish things off, I color the outlines based on the specific area. For example, for the leaves and the stem, I use a much darker green. During the process, I apply the color provisionally using a very bright tone, as this makes it easier to see which areas are being affected by the layer. It's a very simple step to execute, but really rewarding. Now it's time to create a background that complements the sunflower. Since the sunflower is the focal point and the sole reason for this illustration, a flat gray surface would be perfectly fine. However, I want to add something for the background, even if it's something simple. First, I place a geometric shape that roughly conforms to the character's silhouette and wraps around it visually. This shape is temporary for now, and I will change it later, although the overall idea remains the same. I then project a shadow of the character's own silhouette onto this form. Since it's just an effect, it's fairly simple to implement. I also add noise-textured gradients that blend into the geometric shape behind the character. Finally, I draw lines along the character's outline to reinforce the rim light, improving clarity and helping to further separate the figure from the background. Here you can see some of the options I was considering for the background. Basically soft, undefined shapes with low contrast and a slightly blurred look to add some texture. But none of them really convinced me, so I ended up discarding them all. Sometimes more is less. And with this, the job is pretty much done. Let's check out the result. Honestly, I'm quite happy with the final result. It's obviously far from a masterpiece, and compared to some illustrations online, it might look like a preschooler's drawing. Still, I feel I achieved what I set out to do. I managed to finish this piece in a reasonable amount of time while still getting a result I consider solid and continuing to refine my drawing style. However, while editing the video, I noticed several parts of the illustration that I am not entirely happy with and wish I had handled differently. I think it is essential to keep a critical eye on both the strengths and weaknesses of every project. This is not necessarily to fix what I personally consider mistakes in this specific piece. Otherwise, I would likely never finish it, but to ensure the next one turns out a little better than the last. That's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.
One last thing before you go. Did you know that the center of a sunflower is actually made up of hundreds of tiny flowers? Thanks for watching.